Beneath the eternal sun of the Mediterranean, when the winds carried the salt and scent of empire, two powers looked across the same sea and saw mirrors of their own destiny. The world in the 3rd century before Christ was no longer a mosaic of city-states and wandering kings. It was becoming an arena for civilizations that dreamed not merely of survival, but of mastery. To the north, rising from the 7 hills on the banks of the Tiber, was Rome. A republic born from the ashes of monarchy, disciplined, restless, unyielding. To the south, glittering along the coast of North Africa, was Carthage, the child of Phoenicia, a city of merchants and mariners, its harbors filled with sails and its vaults heavy with silver and spice. Between them stretched a sea that would soon run red, a century-long crucible in which the fate of the ancient world would be decided. Rome had clawed its way from obscurity, devouring the Italian peninsula through war and alliance, building legions whose discipline could break mountains. But Rome was still a land power, its heart beating to the rhythm of the march and the clash of steel upon stone. Carthage, in contrast, ruled the waves. Born of traders from Tyre, the Carthaginians knew the sea as Rome knew the sword. They spoke the language of trade and tribute, of shipwrights and sailors, and their city was the richest in the Western world. Carthage's fleets crisscrossed the Mediterranean from Spain to Sicily, from Sardinia to the coast of Africa, its merchants sowing influence like seeds. And yet, between these two titans, fate had already placed a spark. That spark was Sicily, an island lush, fertile and rich, the jewel of the central Mediterranean. Whoever held Sicily controlled the sea routes between east and west. For centuries, it had been a prize contested by Greeks, Carthaginians, and native Sicilians alike. But now, as the 3rd century dawned, the island became a chessboard where the next age of history would begin. The city of Messana sat upon the northeastern edge of that island, a gateway between Italy and the Mediterranean. It was there, in 264 BCE, that the first threads of destiny tightened. A band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines, soldiers of fortune who had seized the city years before, found themselves threatened by the mighty Greek ruler of Syracuse. Desperate, they called for help. And in that cry for aid lay the fuse of the First Punic War. The Mamertines first appealed to Carthage, whose fleets quickly arrived and offered protection. But suspicion, greed, and ambition are the oldest companions of power. The Mamertines then turned to Rome, promising allegiance if the Republic would intervene. In the Senate of Rome, debate raged. Some warned that war in Sicily would entangle the Republic in a foreign struggle far beyond the mainland. Others, more ambitious, saw opportunity, a chance to step beyond Italy and test the might of Rome upon the world stage. In the end, ambition triumphed. The Senate voted to send aid, and in that moment, the course of centuries changed. Rome had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. When the first Roman legions marched across the narrow strait into Sicily, they did not yet know they had declared war on Carthage. The Carthaginians, who had long seen Sicily as their sphere of influence, viewed the Roman arrival as provocation, even invasion. Diplomacy failed, as it always does when the scent of power is in the air. In 264 BCE, the First Punic War began, a war unlike any Rome had ever fought before, a war that would last nearly a quarter of a century and forge the Republic into an empire of iron. The first clashes were on land, where Rome's legions proved their worth. The Carthaginian forces, largely mercenaries from Africa, Iberia, and Gaul, were formidable but fractured. Roman discipline, honed by centuries of brutal campaigns in Italy, overwhelmed Carthaginian armies in open battle. Yet Carthage held the sea, and its fleets blockaded Rome's positions, starving them of supplies and victory. For Rome, accustomed to fighting on land, the sea was a mystery, a place of danger and uncertainty. But Rome learned quickly, and if the Republic was to survive, it would have to become a naval power. What followed was one of the most astonishing transformations in ancient history. In a matter of years, a people with no maritime tradition built one of the largest fleets the world had ever seen. Legend tells that Rome captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship and used it as a model, reproducing it hundreds of times. But even imitation was not enough. The Romans invented a weapon that turned sea battles into land battles, the corvus, a great boarding bridge fitted with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships, locking them together so Roman soldiers could storm across and fight as if on solid ground. With this innovation, Rome turned the tide. The first great naval victory came at Mylae in 260 BCE, where the consul Gaius Duilius shattered the Carthaginian fleet. The Romans celebrated as if Neptune himself had blessed them, erecting a column adorned with the prows of captured ships. Yet Carthage was not so easily broken. The war dragged on for years, devouring men and treasure as both sides fought across Sicily, Sardinia, and the waters of the western Mediterranean. Carthage had the advantage of wealth and ships, Rome the advantage of endurance. In 256 BCE, the Romans launched an audacious invasion of Africa itself, hoping to strike at the heart of Carthage. Led by Regulus, their legions landed near modern Tunisia and won early victories. But pride often follows triumph, and the gods of war are swift to punish arrogance. The Carthaginians, under the guidance of a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, rallied and annihilated the Roman force. Regulus was captured, and his army destroyed. Yet even in defeat, the Romans refused to yield. The First Punic War became a struggle of exhaustion, with fleets rising and sinking, cities besieged and retaken, thousands dying on both sides. Storms claimed more ships than battle did. At times it seemed as though the sea itself was weary of war, devouring entire fleets in waves of fury. Still, Rome built and rebuilt, pouring men and timber into the maw of conflict. By 241 BCE, after 23 years of struggle, Carthage's strength was spent. Its treasury was empty, its fleet battered. The decisive blow came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, where Rome's newly rebuilt navy crushed the Carthaginian fleet and severed its supply lines to Sicily. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Sicily was surrendered to Rome, the first Roman province beyond Italy. Tribute was demanded, and Carthage, humbled, withdrew from its island stronghold. For Rome, it was a moment of triumph, but also transformation. The Republic had tasted empire, and the taste was sweet. No longer confined to the Italian peninsula, Rome now looked outward, its ambition awakened. Yet beneath the ashes of defeat, Carthage endured. Its merchants still traded, its shipyards still worked, and its pride still burned. The peace Rome imposed was not peace at all, but an interlude, a silence between storms. Across the sea, in the great harbor of Carthage, fathers told their sons of the humiliation at Aegates, of the islands lost and the tribute paid. Among those sons were the Barcids, a family of warriors whose name would soon echo through eternity. Hamilcar Barca, the general who had commanded Carthaginian forces in the final years of the war, had not forgotten the taste of Roman betrayal. When peace forced him to lay down his sword, he turned his eyes westward to Spain, a new land of wealth, metals, and soldiers. There, he built a new Carthaginian power, one that would rise again. And with him was his son, a boy who would grow into the most feared commander Rome would ever face. His name was Hannibal. In Rome, few sensed the storm that was gathering beyond the horizon. The Republic celebrated its victory, expanding its reach into Corsica and Sardinia, enforcing order with iron and law. But history never rests. It merely waits for men bold enough to awaken it. And in the hills of Spain, where the silver mines glimmered beneath the sun, a new war was being born. One that would bring elephants across the Alps, fire to the heart of Italy, and fear into the soul of Rome itself. The First Punic War had made Rome a power. The second would test its very survival. In the sun-baked hills of Carthaginian Spain, young Hannibal Barca grew up in the shadow of defeat, but also in the embrace of ambition and vengeance. His father, Hamilcar, was a man forged in the crucible of the First Punic War, tempered by loss and hardened by humiliation. Carthage had survived, but the sting of Rome's ascendancy burned like a brand upon the city's soul. Hamilcar taught his son that Rome was not merely an adversary, it was a force that must be confronted, broken, and humbled. And so, before the boy's lips could speak fully in the tongue of men, he swore an oath, that he would never befriend Rome, and that his life would be devoted to Carthage's vengeance. That oath would become the compass for a lifetime, guiding Hannibal's hand as he grew from a child into a commander whose very name would send shivers through the hearts of Roman senators. Spain at the time was a mosaic of tribes, cities, and mineral wealth. The silver mines shimmered in the sun like veins of fortune, and both Rome and Carthage sought to claim them. Hamilcar, shrewd and relentless, moved south from the Carthaginian heartlands, conquering tribes one by one, not merely with sword and spear, but with alliances, marriages, and political cunning. By the time Hannibal took command in the 220s BCE, Carthage had carved out a new power base in Iberia, rich in soldiers, wealth, and ambition. Hannibal learned from his father that wars are not won by single battles alone, but by patience, planning, and the shaping of the world before the first sword is drawn. The young general's first campaigns were in the hills and river valleys of Iberia, where he faced tribes both stubborn and fierce. Hannibal, unlike many commanders of his age, did not rely solely on brute force. He understood terrain, weather, and psychology. He studied his enemies, learned their habits, and molded his army accordingly. Iberian warriors, mercenaries from Gaul, and disciplined Carthaginian infantry became the pieces on his board, and Hannibal became a master strategist, turning every disadvantage into an opportunity. Cities fell, alliances were won, and Rome's influence, though distant, began to feel the pressure of a new Carthaginian rising. It was during this time that Rome, emboldened by its victories in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, sought to extend its influence into Spain. The Republic could not yet know that its expansion would provoke a storm of unmatched ferocity. When the Romans demanded the surrender of certain Carthaginian settlements along the Ebro River, Hannibal refused. Here was a young general, only 26, already moving pieces across the board that centuries of historians would call genius. His defiance was calculated, yet fierce. It was not mere stubbornness, but the spark of destiny. Rome responded as it always did, with rigid determination. A delegation of senators arrived in Spain, demanding compliance. But Hannibal, as ever, answered not with words alone. In the eyes of Rome, he became both an enigma and a threat. His reputation spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean, carried by merchants, mercenaries, and fearful allies. Every refusal, every maneuver was a whisper of war yet to come. By 219 BCE, tension reached its peak. The city of Saguntum, a Roman ally deep within the Carthaginian sphere, became the focal point. Hannibal, under orders from Carthage but driven by his oath, laid siege to the city. For 8 months, walls burned and catapults roared, while defenders fought with desperation born of the knowledge that their fate was entwined with powers far beyond their borders. When Saguntum fell, the Mediterranean held its breath. Rome could not ignore the insult. Hannibal's attack had violated the fragile agreements that Rome counted upon, and the Senate, fueled by fear, fury, and honor, declared war. This was no longer a regional conflict. It was a war destined to reshape the map of the ancient world. The Second Punic War had begun, Hannibal, now a general whose name would become legend, prepared a campaign that no historian could have foreseen. A campaign that would lead him across mountains, through snow, and into the very heart of Rome. Hannibal's army was a mosaic of nations: Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Carthaginians, each bringing their own skills and temperaments. But the most striking element of his force was the elephants. Colossal beasts of war, trained to trample and terrify, carried Hannibal's will across the landscape like living siege engines. Ancient chroniclers would speak of the sight of these elephants, eyes flaming with both fear and fury, moving across plains and rivers as omens of doom. To Rome, the very idea that a Carthaginian army might cross the Alps and descend into Italy was unthinkable. Yet Hannibal embraced it, planning a march that would become one of the most daring in military history. The march over the Alps was a test of endurance, courage, and human spirit. For months, Hannibal's army battled bitter cold, treacherous cliffs, and avalanches of snow that buried men and animals alike. Tribes of the mountains resisted, harassing the army with arrows, rocks, and cunning. Hannibal, however, possessed a mind as sharp as any sword. He negotiated with some tribes, crushed or evaded others, and adapted constantly, his army learning the rhythm of the mountains as one body, one will. Of the elephants that had begun the journey, only a handful survived, yet even those few struck terror into the hearts of the Romans, a psychological weapon as potent as the sword itself. When Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, the plains of northern Italy stretched before him like a new world. Rome, confident in its armies and fortified cities, was unprepared for an enemy who had brought war across mountains thought impassable. The battles that followed, at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and ultimately at Cannae, were masterpieces of strategy and audacity. At Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into an ambush, his cavalry striking with precision while infantry closed the trap. At Lake Trasimene, a fog-laden morning became the stage for an annihilation as Romans found themselves trapped against the water and overwhelmed by Carthaginian skill. Cannae, in 216 BCE, became legend. The Romans, perhaps too confident in their numbers, marched into a valley where Hannibal's army enveloped them in a double crescent, pressing from all sides. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Romans fell in a single day, the field littered with bodies, the air heavy with smoke, dust, and despair. Hannibal's genius lay not in cruelty alone, but in understanding the psychology of men, in bending their expectations and turning their strengths into weaknesses. For Rome, it was a catastrophe, yet even in the shadow of total defeat, the Republic endured. Rome's resilience became its defining trait. Where other cities might have surrendered, Rome raised new legions, called on its allies, and refused negotiation. Dictators like Fabius Maximus advocated patience, avoiding direct engagement while wearing down Hannibal's forces, earning the title of the Delayer. The Republic learned that survival required endurance, that victory was not measured in a single battle, but in the ability to absorb loss and respond with relentless determination. Across Italy, Hannibal moved like a phantom, winning battles yet never capturing Rome itself. The city's walls remained unbreached, its people determined, its spirit unbroken. Hannibal's victories, while brilliant, could not achieve a political conquest. Allies wavered, supplies dwindled, and the Carthaginian dream of a decisive end remained just beyond reach. Rome, in turn, adapted, sending armies to Spain to cut off Hannibal's reinforcements and slowly regaining lost ground. Thus, the war stretched on, a relentless tide of battle, strategy, and human endurance. Hannibal's oath and ambition shaped every move, yet Rome's refusal to yield created a paradox. Victory in battle did not equate to victory in war. The stage was set for a transformation in strategy, for new leaders to rise and for the war to move beyond the familiar landscapes of Italy into distant theaters, where Rome and Carthage would clash once again. testing the limits of men, beasts, and empires alike. In the shadow of Hannibal's march and the blood-soaked fields of Cannae, the Mediterranean waited. Spain remained a battleground, Carthage's wealth still a prize, and Rome's ambition unquenched. The Second Punic War was no longer a local conflict. It had become a saga, a story of fate, genius, and unyielding resolve. And within that saga, the seeds of Rome's ultimate triumph were already taking root, hidden in the loyalty of allies, the endurance of legions, and the inexorable rhythm of a republic learning to bend the world to its will. As the shadows of Cannae lingered over the Italian countryside, Rome faced its darkest hour. The Senate convened in solemn chambers, aware that their city had survived, yet teetered on the brink of despair. Families mourned sons who would never return, farms lay abandoned, and the very soil of Italy seemed to weep under the weight of Hannibal's triumphs. And yet, in the midst of devastation, Rome's spirit refused to break. From its grief, a new determination arose. The Republic understood that sheer endurance could match even the brilliance of a general like Hannibal, and that time, allies, and unyielding resolve were weapons as potent as elephants and cavalry. Meanwhile, Hannibal, confident yet cautious, moved through Italy like a force of nature. His victories had brought fear to cities and submission from some allies, but not the decisive victory that might topple Rome itself. Supply lines stretched thin, the local population grew wary, and the Carthaginian dream of conquest faced the stark reality of logistics, attrition, and diplomacy. Hannibal's genius lay not merely in battle, but in understanding the human terrain, the shifting loyalties of Italian states, the fears of allies, and the temperament of the Roman Republic. Even so, the impossibility of breaching Rome's walls left him a commander triumphant, yet unfulfilled. In Spain, across the Pyrenees and along the Iberian rivers, Rome quietly rebuilt its strength. A young general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, emerged from the folds of history as a man of vision and courage. He understood that defeating Hannibal required not merely imitation but audacity, a willingness to strike at Carthage where Hannibal could not defend. Scipio trained his legions with a precision and rigor that rivaled the discipline of Rome itself. He mastered both siegecraft and maneuver, preparing for campaigns in lands distant from the familiar hills of Italy. By 209 BCE, Scipio had crossed into Spain, landing at a time when Carthaginian power there was strong but stretched. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, commanded forces loyal to Carthage, guarding supply lines and fortresses, yet Scipio's strategy was relentless. With calculated strikes, he seized cities, disrupted reinforcements, and turned local tribes into allies. Scipio's rise was a testament to Rome's adaptability, where Hannibal relied on surprise and tactical genius. Scipio combined strategy, diplomacy, and foresight, turning Spain into a theater of Roman influence and threatening Hannibal's position in Italy. The pivotal moment arrived when Hasdrubal attempted to bring reinforcements to Hannibal across the Alps. In a dramatic clash at the Metaurus River, Roman forces intercepted and destroyed the Carthaginian army. Hasdrubal fell, and with him went the last hope of Hannibal receiving aid from Spain. Italy's landscape, once a canvas for Hannibal's brilliance, began to tilt inexorably back toward Rome. The tide was turning, subtle at first, yet unstoppable. With Spain secured, Scipio set his eyes on Africa. Carthage itself, long the dream of revenge and the seat of empire, became the stage for the war's final act. Rome, learning from its previous mistakes, prepared a fleet and legions to cross the sea. The strategic brilliance lay in choosing the theater where Hannibal could be confronted on equal terms, far from the Italian cities he knew so well. Crossing the Mediterranean was a gamble, but one that would soon prove decisive. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed near Carthage, his army a blend of veterans, allies, and mercenaries trained to strike hard and fast. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, marched to meet him, bringing the war to the heart of the Carthaginian homeland. The two generals, titans of strategy and ambition, faced each other not as armies alone, but as embodiments of their civilizations. Carthage was rich, powerful, and confident, yet haunted by the memory of Rome's persistence and Scipio's calculated advance. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation that would decide the fate of the Western Mediterranean. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE became a symphony of strategy, courage, and destiny. Hannibal deployed his remaining elephants at the forefront, a terrifying spectacle meant to break the Roman lines. Yet Scipio anticipated the charge. The Romans opened corridors, allowing the beasts to pass through harmlessly, and the disciplined legions closed in behind, striking at Carthaginian infantry with precision. Numidian cavalry, allies to Rome, harassed the flanks, cutting off escape and supply. Hannibal fought with brilliance, maneuvering his troops to resist, but the Romans, disciplined and relentless, pressed forward with the momentum of history itself. When the dust cleared, Carthage lay defeated. Hannibal survived, a figure of legend and despair, while Rome stood triumphant, yet tempered by the blood and sacrifice that had carved its victory. The terms of peace were severe. Carthage surrendered its fleet, paid tribute, and ceded Spain to Rome. The Republic had not merely won a battle, it had crushed a rival, secured its dominance of the Mediterranean, and demonstrated the power of endurance over brilliance, discipline over genius. The victory at Zama marked the end of the Second Punic War, yet it was also a beginning. Rome had learned the lessons of Hannibal, that genius could strike anywhere, that endurance could defeat brilliance, and that ambition demanded both courage and prudence. Carthage, humbled but unbroken, retreated into its walls, preserving its merchants, its wealth, and its spirit. The city would endure for another half-century, a shadow of its former might, but still a center of trade and culture in the Western world. Yet Rome's triumph carried a warning. The Republic had expanded its reach, but with expansion came new responsibilities, new enemies, and new temptations. Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain were now provinces. Rome's influence stretched across the Mediterranean like an unseen hand. The Republic had grown into an empire in all but name, and with empire came the certainty of future conflict. Carthage, though defeated, would harbor resentment, ambition, and a memory of lost glory. The seeds of the Third Punic War, a century-long reckoning, were already sown in the fertile soil of vengeance and pride. Hannibal, the man who had crossed mountains, shattered legions, and haunted the dreams of Rome, withdrew into history, but his shadow lingered. His campaigns became lessons in strategy and endurance, studied by generals for centuries. Rome, having faced annihilation and survived, emerged tempered and confident, ready to assert dominance over a world that had once seemed beyond its grasp. In the quiet streets of Carthage, among its merchants and citizens, whispers of fate and revenge began to circulate. Rome had won, yet the fire of Carthaginian pride still burned. Across the Mediterranean, in the hills and valleys of Italy, Rome's citizens celebrated their survival, yet knew the cost of empire. A price paid in blood, in courage, and in relentless vigilance. The Second Punic War had transformed the Republic, forged its armies, and marked the rise of a power that would come to dominate the ancient world for centuries to come. And so, the stage was set for the final act in the Punic saga. A war that would end not merely with victory or defeat, but with the annihilation of a civilization. Carthage, once a jewel of the Mediterranean, would face Rome's inexorable march, and the echoes of empire, ambition, and vengeance would resound across history, leaving a lesson for all who dare to dream of conquest and defiance. The Mediterranean, after the storms of Hannibal's campaigns, seemed for a moment to breathe. Rome, triumphant yet vigilant, had secured its dominance. Carthage, bruised and humbled, turned inward, rebuilding its walls, its commerce, and the fragile threads of its former glory. Yet beneath the surface, tensions festered. The Second Punic War had left scars beyond armies and cities. It had carved into the soul of Carthage a memory of humiliation, of blood spilled on Italian soil, and of a republic that had survived impossible odds. Rome, on the other hand, had tasted power and would not forget the lesson that endurance could overcome brilliance. The seeds of the Third Punic War were quietly, inexorably taking root. Carthage, despite its defeat, remained a city of wealth, culture, and maritime prowess. Its harbors thrummed with ships, its markets with goods from Africa, Spain, and beyond. Merchants, artisans, and bankers labored tirelessly, yet their city existed under the shadow of Roman oversight. The peace imposed by Rome after Zama forbade Carthage from waging war without Roman approval and demanded heavy tribute. The city's pride bristled at the constraints, but survival demanded acquiescence. Carthaginian senators, merchants, and generals debated endlessly how to restore their city's influence without provoking Rome's wrath, how to live in the shadow of a power that had defeated them twice. Yet history, it seems, has no patience for complacency. In 151 BCE, a local Numidian king, Massinissa, a former ally of Rome, began encroaching upon Carthaginian territory. Farms burned, trade routes disrupted, and Carthage's pleas to Rome for enforcement of prior treaties were met with silence, indifference, or subtle encouragement of Massinissa's aggression. The Republic, confident in its supremacy and eager to see Carthage weakened further, allowed the harassment to continue. The humiliation was profound. The city that had once threatened Rome itself now faced predation on its borders with little recourse. The debates within Carthage grew bitter. Some argued for submission, others for armed resistance, even at the risk of violating the treaty with Rome. Among the latter was a generation of leaders and soldiers who had grown up in the memory of Hannibal's campaigns, who revered the oath to resist Rome's dominance. Their argument was simple yet perilous. If Carthage did not act, it would be erased slowly, swallowed by Rome's inexorable rise. If it did act, it would risk annihilation, but with honor intact. The die was cast, and Carthage chose to defend itself. When Carthaginian forces struck back against Massinissa, Rome used this as a pretext. In 149 BCE, the Senate declared that Carthage had violated the peace treaty and ordered its destruction. Rome, now confident in its might, prepared for the final confrontation. The Third Punic War, unlike the previous conflicts, was less a struggle of strategic brilliance and more a campaign of annihilation. Rome was determined not merely to defeat Carthage, but to erase it from history. The Mediterranean had long been a theater for civilization, commerce, and war. Now it would witness the obliteration of one of its greatest cities. Carthage, aware of the Roman tide approaching, prepared for siege. Its walls, formidable and ancient, bristled with soldiers, mercenaries, and citizens ready to fight for survival. Streets became trenches, rooftops watchtowers, every stone was a weapon, every alley a defensive line. The city's engineers worked tirelessly, building towers, barricades, and fortifications, while merchants and artisans turned their skills to warcraft, forging weapons and devising strategies to prolong resistance. The spirit of Hannibal lingered in the hearts of Carthage's defenders, clever, unyielding, and defiant. Rome, meanwhile, advanced with overwhelming force. Consul Scipio Aemilianus, a man whose name carried the weight of past victories and the promise of finality, led legions trained for patience, precision, and relentless assault. Unlike Hannibal, who relied on genius and audacity, Scipio understood the value of siegecraft, attrition, and psychological warfare. Rome's approach was methodical: encircle, starve, and batter, leaving no hope for escape or relief. For Carthage, every day was a struggle against inevitability, every hour a battle for the survival of civilization itself. The siege began in earnest. Roman legions constructed massive earthworks encircling the city, cutting it off from trade and aid. Ships that had once carried Carthage's merchants to distant lands were captured or sunk, and famine began to gnaw at the population. Within the walls, desperation bred both heroism and tragedy. Citizens armed themselves alongside soldiers, children and the elderly worked to repair breaches and carry supplies, and leaders marshaled every resource for resistance. Tales of courage spread across the city, families fighting together, soldiers holding gates against overwhelming odds, and every street becoming a battlefield. Months turned into years, and the siege became a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and defiance. Roman engineers built towers to hurl missiles over walls, dug trenches to undermine fortifications, and used fire and battering rams to breach the gates. Carthage's defenders responded with ingenuity. Tunnels, countermines, boiling oil, and relentless counterattacks. The city became a crucible, each street and plaza a theater of struggle, each building a fortress or tomb. Yet the balance of power was inexorably tipping. Rome's resources were immense, its determination unwavering. Carthage, no matter how clever or courageous, could not match the Republic's industrial and military might indefinitely. By 146 BCE, after years of siege, Rome's forces finally breached the walls. What followed was horror and legend intertwined. Streets ran with blood, buildings burned, and the cries of the dying echoed against centuries of stone. The Carthaginians fought to the last man, refusing to surrender, while Roman soldiers advanced with systematic precision. According to some accounts, the city was utterly razed, its walls torn down, its fields salted, and its population enslaved or slaughtered. The wealth of Carthage, gold, silver, and treasures of a trading empire, was seized or destroyed. What had been one of the great cities of the Mediterranean was no more. Yet even in destruction, Carthage left a legacy. Its spirit, ingenuity, and defiance endured in the memory of Rome and the world. The Republic had proven its dominance, but history would remember not only the conqueror, but the courage of the conquered. Hannibal's oath, the pride of a city and the brilliance of generals past, had shaped an epic of human ambition, endurance, and tragedy. Rome had triumphed, yet in that triumph lay the seed of its own evolution, for an empire built on conquest carries both glory and the weight of the lives it consumes. As the dust settled over the ruins, the Mediterranean watched in silence. The Punic Wars had lasted over a century, spanning generations, mountains, seas, and deserts. They had transformed Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean hegemon. Carthage, once a rival of unmatched wealth and maritime skill, had been erased, leaving behind legends, memories, and a cautionary tale about the cost of defiance against an inexorable force. The war, in its finality, reshaped the ancient world, setting the stage for Rome's expansion into Greece, Egypt, and beyond, and forging the narrative of empire that would echo for centuries. The echoes of Carthage, its generals, its warriors, and its people survived in memory, story, and history. Rome had won, but the Mediterranean had been forever changed. Trade routes, cities, and alliances shifted, the balance of power redefined. The Punic Wars were more than battles. They were a saga of civilization, ambition, ingenuity, and endurance, a story of what happens when the will of a people meets the inexorable force of destiny. And in that silence, after the fires had cooled and the smoke of battle had lifted, one truth remained. History remembers both the conquerors and the conquered, and the lessons of empire, vengeance, and human resilience endure whispering across centuries to those who seek to understand the rise and fall of civilizations. With Carthage reduced to ashes, the Mediterranean lay under Rome's unchallenged gaze. The Republic had achieved what few civilizations could. It had erased a rival, expanded its dominion, and imposed its will over a vast and complex region. Yet the triumph was not merely the removal of an enemy, it was a transformation. Rome was no longer a city-state of disciplined legions, it was an empire in all but name, stretching across lands it had once only dreamed of reaching. The lessons of the Punic Wars resonated in every corner of its domain. The cost of endurance, the value of strategy, and the brutal price of ambition. The streets of Rome itself pulsed with pride and unease. Monuments were erected to honor victories at Mylae, Zama, and the siege of Carthage. Senators and generals celebrated, but among them lingered a subtle apprehension. The Republic had grown too vast, its armies too numerous, and its influence too pervasive. Hannibal's ghost, the memory of the Alps, and the resilience of Carthaginian resistance haunted the consciousness of Rome, reminding citizens and leaders alike that victory carried as much danger as it did glory. Political debates raged over how to govern newly acquired territories, how to integrate allies, and how to ensure that the Republic's expansion did not become its undoing. In the provinces, the effects were immediate and profound. Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, once battlegrounds of war, now fell under Roman administration. Governors were appointed, taxation imposed, and legions stationed to maintain order. Carthage itself, though obliterated, left a vacuum that Rome filled with roads, colonies, and trade networks. Merchants moved goods with unprecedented security, while armies enforced a Pax Romana, a Roman peace forged through discipline and might. Yet even in these triumphs, the echoes of the Punic Wars lingered. The lessons of Hannibal's cunning, the sacrifices of Italian allies, and the human cost of relentless conflict were never far from memory. Culturally, Rome absorbed lessons as well as territories. Military innovations from the Punic Wars, formations, siegecraft, naval strategy, were codified and studied. Hannibal became a figure of both fear and admiration. His tactics were dissected in forums, taught in training grounds, and recounted in stories that blended history and legend. Carthaginian bravery, ingenuity, and maritime expertise influenced Roman thought, inspiring engineers, generals, and even politicians. Rome's victories were thus not solely military but intellectual. The Republic learned from its adversaries, transforming defeat into a tool of future conquest. Economically, the Punic Wars reshaped the Mediterranean. Trade that had once been dominated by Carthage now flowed through Roman hands. Markets in Italy, Sicily, and newly pacified provinces prospered. Wealth accumulated in the city of Rome, fueling public works, temples, and infrastructure. Yet with prosperity came inequality, as senators, merchants, and generals enriched themselves at the expense of common citizens and conquered peoples. The Republic's victories, while monumental, carried consequences. Social unrest, political tension, and the seeds of internal conflict began to grow alongside Rome's external empire. The psychological landscape of Rome also shifted. The memory of Hannibal, the general who had crossed mountains, shattered armies, and brought terror to the heart of Italy, became a benchmark for fear and respect. Romans spoke of the Punic Wars not merely as battles, but as a crucible that had forged the Republic. Citizens understood the stakes of empire. Vigilance was eternal, courage demanded sacrifice, and the will of the state outweighed individual glory. Stories of Cannae, of Trebia, and of Lake Trasimene were recounted as both caution and inspiration, shaping the moral and strategic framework of Rome for generations. In the wider Mediterranean, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Greek cities, once independent and proud, now faced the inexorable presence of Rome. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, observed the rise of a new hegemon with wary calculation. The remnants of Carthaginian influence in Africa persisted in trade and memory, but their political and military power had been extinguished. Rome had moved from regional actor to arbiter of the Mediterranean world, its influence touching every shore, every port, and every trading route. Yet for all its triumphs, Rome was aware of the moral and existential weight of its actions. The destruction of Carthage was absolute, a lesson in both the power and peril of conquest. The Republic-MS leaders understood that their victories had not merely reshaped geography, but had redefined the human and ethical framework of the ancient world. To triumph was to bear responsibility, and to wield power without restraint risked corruption, decay, and eventual collapse. The Punic Wars had taught that endurance, strategy, and discipline were essential, but so too was prudence and foresight. Amidst the ruins of Carthage, some survivors and captives carried memories of a lost civilization. They became merchants, artisans, and laborers across the Mediterranean, preserving fragments of Carthaginian knowledge, religion, and culture. In markets, ports, and households, the spirit of Carthage persisted quietly, influencing art, commerce, and maritime practice. Rome, in its glory, had defeated a rival, yet it had also inherited its legacy, a complex inheritance of both skill and ambition. In the centuries that followed, the Punic Wars became legend, their stories told in forums, schools, and temples. Generals studied the strategies of Hannibal and Scipio, politicians invoked the moral lessons of perseverance and restraint, and citizens recounted tales of sacrifice and courage. The wars were remembered not merely as conflicts, but as epic sagas, blending history and myth, teaching lessons about ambition, power, and the enduring human spirit. Rome, having emerged victorious, now faced a new challenge: to govern an empire without overreach, to maintain discipline while prosperity tempted corruption, and to transform military dominance into lasting stability. The Punic Wars, in their vast sweep of time, geography, and human cost, had set the stage for Rome's ascent to global power. They had forged a civilization capable of endurance, brilliance, and adaptation, yet reminded all who witnessed their consequences that greatness is inseparable from responsibility. Even in reflection, the story of Rome and Carthage resonates with mythic power. The Republic, disciplined and unyielding, had confronted genius and survived. Carthage, proud and defiant, had faced annihilation and endured in memory. Together, they created a narrative that would echo through centuries, shaping ideas of war, strategy, empire, and human resilience. The Mediterranean, once a theater of competing city-states, had been transformed into a Roman dominion, its shores, rivers, and islands under the watchful eye of a republic tempered by fire, ambition, and the inexorable sweep of history. And so the Punic Wars closed not with silence, but with echoes. Echoes that would ripple through generations, shaping politics, culture, and military thought for centuries. The Republic had proven that endurance could triumph over genius, that strategy could overcome audacity, and that the ambition of a people disciplined and determined could reshape the world. The legacy of Carthage remained as both a cautionary tale and a source of enduring fascination, a reminder that even in defeat, courage and intellect leave a mark upon history that no conqueror can entirely erase. And so the fires of the Punic Wars faded, leaving behind a world irrevocably transformed. Rome had emerged, tempered by blood and strategy, an empire in all but name, its legions disciplined, its citizens resilient, and its vision of dominion unshakable. Carthage, once a jewel of the Mediterranean, had been reduced to ruins, yet its spirit endured in memory, story, and the lessons it had imparted to friend and foe alike. The echoes of those wars, of elephants crossing mountains, of legions trapped and triumphant, of cities besieged and annihilated, reverberated across the ancient world, shaping politics, culture, and the very understanding of what it meant to wield power. In every hill, every plain, every coastline touched by the conflict, the stories of heroism, strategy, and sacrifice lingered. Hannibal's oath, the genius of Scipio, the courage of Carthaginian defenders, and the unyielding endurance of Rome became more than history. They became legend. The Mediterranean had been a stage for empire, ambition, and fate. And through these trials, a new world had been forged, one in which the lessons of war, resilience, and morality would echo through generations. The Punic Wars remind us that the tides of history are shaped not only by victory, but by endurance, by the choices of men and nations under pressure, and by the courage to act when the world seems insurmountable. Rome had risen from the crucible, but the cost was written in fire and blood. Carthage may have fallen, yet it had left an indelible mark on the imagination, the memory, and the very fabric of Mediterranean civilization. And as the dust settled, the Mediterranean itself seemed to breathe anew, calm yet vigilant, a witness to the rise of an empire and the tragedy of a fallen city. History had been made, but it was never static. For in every ruin, in every lesson learned, there remained the whisper of possibility, of ambition, of courage, and of the enduring human spirit that dares to confront destiny itself.